Hello everyone, myself Dr. Amandeep Singh. So I am here to present my talk on topic of development of therapeutic guidelines. Mean to say that what types of various rules are there for the therapeutic use of the medicines. What are the various objective of this concept? Understand the importance therapeutic guidelines in promotion of rational use of medicines. Understand the process to develop a guidelines. Understand expert group role in development of a guidelines. Summary and scope is basically identify and refining the subject area is the first step is the development of a guidelines. Conveying and running guidelines development groups in the next step. On the basis of systemic reviews, the group assesses the evidence about the clinical questions and the conditions. This evidence is then translated into the recommendation with the clinical practice guidelines. The last step in guidance development is external review of the guidance. Identifying and refining the subject area of a guideline. Guidelines can be developed for a wide range of subjects. Clinical areas can be concerned with conditions of normal uterine bleeding, coronary artery disease. So these are the basic diseases which are covered in this case of conditions. These are the coronary artery disease as well as the uterine bleeding. Procedures, coronary artery bypass as a surgery. Given a large number of potential areas, some priority setting is needed to be selected an area for guideline development. Potential area can emerge from an assessment of the major causes of morbidity and mortality for a given population under about the proximate of healthcare process for the evidence that they effective in their improving patient outcome. The ultimate goal is improvement in the patient care or need to be conserve resource in providing care. Refining the subject areas, the topic for guideline development will usually need to refine before the evidence can be assessed in order to answer exact question. Mean you have to form the identify the questions so that they can be answered. Usual way of refining a topic is by dialogue among clinic uh, patients and the potential users for the evaluate of the guidelines. So the questions can be also asked by the patients as well as the various health practitioners. Discussion about the scope of guidelines will also take place within the guidelines development panel. The topic is not refined, the clinical conditions or questions may be too broad in the scope. For example, a guidelines on the management of diabetes could cover primary, secondary, and tertiary care elements of management and also multiple aspects of management such as screening, diagnosis, dietary management, drug therapy, risk factor management, or indications for referral to the consultant. Through all of these could be with the guidelines, the task of development such as guidelines would be considerable. Therefore, a group needs to be clear which areas are not within the scope of their activities. It's possible to develop guidelines that are both broad in scope and evidence-based, but to do usually require considerable time and money, both of which are frequently underestimated by inexperienced developers of evidence-based clinical practice guidelines. Next is the various methods for defining clinical questions of interest. Clinical questions of interest and also identify the process for which evidence needs to be collected and assessed in the section of the models. So, for the same models can be formed by identifying their requirement. A causal pathway is a diagram that illustrates the linkage between interventions or interest and the intermediate, surrogate, and health outcomes. In designing the pathways, guidelines developers may exploit the premises on which their assumptions of their effectiveness are based and outcomes. This identifies the specified questions that must be answered by evidence to justify inclusion of effectiveness and highlights gap in the evidence. Running guideline development groups, setting up a guideline development project to successfully develop a guideline, it may be necessary to convert more one group. A project or management team could undertake the day-to-day running of work such as identification, synthesis and interpretation of relevant evidence, the conveying and running of guideline development groups, and the production of the resulting guidelines. Additional guidelines development would produce recommendation in light of the evidence of the its absence. So next is the group member, and what about their group membership and their role? Identifying stakeholders involves identifying all the groups whose activities would be covered by the guidelines or who have other reasons for having an input to the process. This is an important to ensure adequate discussion of the evidence. So, by which we can confirm that by discussing with each and one aspects with the all group member, we can able to identify that what type of problems are there and how we can resolve for the same. When presented with same evidence, a single specificity group will reach different conclusion than the multidisciplinary. Expert group, the specialty group will be systematically based in favor of performing procedures in which it has a vested interest. For example, the conclusions of group of vascular surgeons favored the use of steroids more than did a mixed group of surgeons and the medical specialist. Individuals' bias may be better balanced in multidisciplinary group, and such balance may produce more valid guidelines. Ideally, the group should have at least, but not more than 12 to 15 members. Too few members limits adequate discussion, and too many members make effective solution on the group decision. So totally 12 to 15 members are involved within this expert group. So ultimate goal is they can give their own opinion for the better system of this medical system. Under certain circumstances, for example, guidelines or for broad clinical areas, it may be necessary to trade off full representation against the requirement of having a functional group. Roles roles required within guidelines development groups are those of group members, group leaders, specialist resources, technical support, administrative support. Group members are invited to participate as individuals working in their field. The role of group leader is to both to ensure the group functions efficiently and to achieve the aim. The ultimate thing is the all meetings which are we can say that assembled. The goal is to obtain a better knowledge for the system. This requires someone with clinical skills and group process skills. Using formal group process rather than informal one in group meeting produces different and possibly better outcomes. Identifying and assessing the evidence. Identifying and assessing the evidence is the best done by performing a systemic review. The purpose of systemic review is to collect all available evidence, assess its potential applicability to the clinical question and consideration, inspect the evidence for susceptibility to bias, and extract and summarize the finding. Next is the sorting evidence. What sort of evidence? Identifying the clinical questions for trust will help set the boundaries for admissible evidence, type of study design, and year of the publication. These are the two major things in this case. For example, questions of the efficacy for interventional usually mean that randomized control trial should be sought. While next is the while questions of risk usually mean the prospective cohort studies should be sought. Where to look for evidence? The first step is gathering the evidence is to see if a suitable recent systemic review has been already published. The library will also identify relevant coherent reviews groups which should also be conducted review in the process. So mean to say that the basic relevant issue or evidence, basic evidence which are concerned with the study we have identified and we can sort accordingly. In a current systemic review is not available, a computer research for Medline and Embase the both software which can determine the basic system. Checking references in article will show additional relevant articles not identified by computer search, and having expert in field examine a list of articles help me to say that we have identified the articles which are concerned with our research or study, so we can able to find a maximum knowledge about the same topic. Computer research for specialized database, hand search, relevant journals are also there. Unpublished materials can be also found from some sources. Assessing studies for relevance. Once studies have been identified, they are assessed for relevance for the clinical questions. Screening for relevance is often possible for the abstract. It narrows the set of the studies, those needing a more detailed assessment using a split rather than the imprint criteria. Skills need for guideline development, literature searching and retrieval. A complete thoroughly research must be there so that we're able to find a better data for the same. Epidemiology, biostatics, health service research, clinical experts might be there, group process expert and writing and the editing process. Summarizing evidence, data are extracted from the relevant studies on the benefits, the harms, whether applicable, the cost of the interventions being considered. These data are surely presented in a form that allow the design and results of studies to be compared, where appropriate meta-analysis can be used to summarize the results. Categorizing evidence, summarized evidence is categorized to reflect its susceptibility to bias. This is the shorthand methods of conveying specific aspects of the evidence to reader the guidelines. A number of such strength of evidence classification scheme exist, but empirical evidence exists only for scheme that categorize effectiveness by the study design. Classifying the evidence that support statement in practice, guidelines, and strength of the recommendation. Guideline developers should use a limited number of explicit criteria, incorporating criteria for which the evidence once gathered need to be interpreted. Next, the translating evidence into the clinical practice. Since conclusive evidence exists for relatively few healthcare procedures, derivative recommendations solely in areas of strong evidence would lead to the guidelines of limited scope of a suitability. This could be a sufficient. For example, the guidelines is to recommendation is the most strongly supported by the treatment. Mean to say that all over, therefore, within the guidelines development process, a decision should be taken about how to penny will be used. That can be strength of recommendation as categories of the scheme. Grading recommendation. It is a common to grade each recommendation in the guidelines. Such information provides the users with an indication of the guidelines development group confidence. It following the strength will produce a desired health outcome strength of our recommendation. So the classification is probably best done by the group panels using a democratic voting process after group discussed and the strength of the evidence. Reviewing and updating guidelines. Guidelines should receive external reviews to ensure content validity, clarity, and applicability. External reviews should cover three areas: people with expertise in the clinical content who can review the guideline as well as to verify the competence of the literature, as who can review the method by which the guidelines was developed, and potentially users of the guidelines who can judge the its proper use. Therapeutic guidelines evidence into the actions. Therapeutic guidelines including the organization not for profit financially self-supporting its objective to produce, publish, and sell products to promote the quality use of the medicine. Its core activity to produce comprehensive disease-based guidelines for therapy-based the best available evidence integrated with the clinical experience. Staffing, administration, medical, as well as the pharmacy editors, information technology, research, evaluation, as well as the market. Next is the expert writing groups. So this basic rule of concept of this all is to conclude the all data in a particular manner. For each title, there is an expert writing group. Expert groups are appointed by the board members of the group, provide interest statement. Copyright is assigned to basically sitting payment are offered to the members. Development cycle, basically this is a complete cycle, 40 authors and a 10 expert, then 6 paced meeting, then 6 editors, 100 reviewers, 25 endorsing organization. So marketing, one of the users and feedback is also there. Guideline characteristic, clinically oriented, arranged according to the clinical problem, clear, practical, and succinct advice. Then is the cover all common areas of the care. Then authorities, expert and independent interpretations, national inputs, and index up to date regularly in by the cycle allowing. What's inside? Basically, you have identify in the case of in this case, I have a used example of UTI, urinary tract infection. What is the condition? What is the non-drug advice? what is general information, advice for standard case, drug recommendation, and special case. Basic basis for recommendation. Where there is a good evidence, it's clear what recommendation can be made. Agreement need on how evidence should be interpreted. Where there is a variable of conflicting evidence, discussion and consequence is needed. Where there is a little evidence, statement are based on the best available evidence and the clinical experience of the experts. Clinical relevance, dose, patient, active compound, endpoint, and duration of therapy. So they all must be recorded. Key evidence issue, publication, relevance to current practice, availability of the evidence. Localizing, availability of therapy, local regulations, patient characteristic, pregnancy or disease, as well as the cost of therapy. Utility of guidelines, problem-based, look up, general practitioner, pharmacist, hospital uh, based, as well as the specialist. Utility for guidelines used as a criteria for the clinical audits and the evaluation basis for local development of consequences with the healthcare institution. So these are the basic guidelines which must be fulfilled for the during use of the, we can say, the formulation of the guidelines. Basis of adaptation of some other country like Japan, China, Spain, Russia, and other. This is an online version of ETG complete. I have given examples of for the Microsoft Internet Explorer. In this case, advise patient. Next is the dietary advice and protection. So all types of advice might be there if you put some kind of disease in the search bar. The method of guideline development should ensure of what treating patient according to the guidelines will achieve the outcomes that are desired. This presents a combination of literature about guidelines development and results of the combined expertise. It considers the 5 steps in initial development of an evidence-based guidelines, the basic implementation evaluation of the practitioner guidelines. So we have discussed in this lecture all about the guidelines, how these are formed, what are the various parts which are involved in it, and how basically they are amended. So thank you so much for your viewing this video.